Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. I love coming to Newfoundland, and I'm here in person. I've been here many times. It's halfway to my hometown of London. And I find St. John's to be the friendliest city in Canada. So, don't disabuse me of that notion with any nasty comments. I'm here to talk about interest rates, deficits. No,
we've got people on. We've got 100 odd people online that can't hear. You're talking already.
So I'm here to talk about interest rates, deficits, and inflation. And I wondered why I was invited until I listened to the Minister of Finance, and it sort of seemed to fall into place. Now, I've got one correction. If you look at my background in your little brochure, it says I have a BS from the London School of Economics. That's not correct. It's a Bachelor's of Science in Economics. LSE does not give degrees in BS. And my presentation is not BS. So why was I invited to be here? I think it's because about 15 years ago, with some colleagues of mine, I did work on provincial government bonds in the Canadian Journal of Economics, and that was what we call subnational debt. National debt is simply debt issued by the federal government, which has the power and the control over the printing press, which is the Bank of Canada. Whereas subnational debt, such as provincial debt in Canada, is like corporate bonds. They suffer a default or rescheduling risk that the federal government doesn't face. And so I'm going to start out, unfortunately, with some algebra. The reason for doing this is that what I'm going to be talking about, as I said, is not BS, it's actually arithmetic. And a lot of the time when we start looking at debt and deficits, it gets political very, very quickly. But a lot of it is not political. It's basically arithmetic. So I'm going to take you through a tiny little bit of algebra very, very quickly to get to where I want to go in terms of financing and the actions in the capital market. So the change in debt is really, really simple. Big D is the debt in time periods T. So the change is just the change in that debt, which is the deficit, operating deficit. You take out the interest, plus the interest on the debt. And this doesn't say D for the province of Newfoundland. It doesn't say D for Bell Canada. It doesn't just say D for Joe Flanagan somewhere in a personal household. It's algebra. It applies to every economic entity. So that's the way in which we look at debt. It's the definitional. And when we look at debt for institutions, we don't look at debt in abstract. We relate it to spending. We relate it to income. Any of you have qualified for a mortgage, they look at the debt, the amount of mortgage relative to your income, or some other sort of measures of cash flow. So we relate debt to income, and the obvious thing for a provincial or government is GDP. So we look at the debt to GDP ratio, which Trevor was talking about. And this is little d, just to sort of subtract it from big D. And if you do a little bit of just rearranging, this, as I said, is arithmetic, you get the basic result that we look at for when we look at governments. That if you've got a target debt to GDP ratio, it obviously depends where you came from, DT minus 1. It depends upon the operating deficit as a percentage of GDP. And it depends upon growth rates and interest rates. So I was listening to the Minister of Finance this morning. They're talking about the deficit to GDP ratio. So that's clearly important. Unless you get the deficit to GDP ratio under control, then the deficit is going to cause the debt to grow. It depends where you came from in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. And then it depends upon the growth rate in the economy, and it depends upon interest rates. This slide I actually put together 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, we got the after effects felt as the euro crisis. And I suppose I should go back a couple of slides. while I was talking about this in 2011 and 12, we were talking about the pigs. Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, because they were subnational governments. They gave up their own currencies in order to have the euro, and they did not control the euro. The European Central Bank, basically the Germans, controlled the euro. And exactly the same, as a province, you do not control the Canadian dollar. And that is the fundamental difference. And way back 10 years ago, we were talking about the problems in the euro and the problems of Portugal and Greece and how they could get out of their debt problems. And listening this morning to the Minister of Finance, it was pretty obvious that she was talking about exactly the same problems as we were talking about 10 years ago in terms of the pig countries, the Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. So in the case of Greece at the time, they had a very high debt to GDP ratio, DT minus 1. They had an enormous deficit, so that was the operating deficit, and they actually got into the euro by over-exaggerating their growth rate, and people felt that they could grow out of their financial problems, mainly because they'd historically had a reasonably high growth rate. The problem was that that growth rate was primarily as a result of adding civil servants and adding people in the public sector, rather than adding people that were sort of generating the basic wealth of Greece. And the result was, when people realized this, interest rates went up dramatically, because the bond market basically said, with a pretty quick reaction, that they weren't going to finance Greece. So this is the basic picture. As I said, this is not finance. This is not economics. There's no theory in this. This is just arithmetic. It's the arithmetics of deficits and debt, that where you go in terms of the debt to GDP ratio depends on where you are at the moment, what the deficit is, how quickly you can grow out of a debt problem, which Greece couldn't, and how much the bondholders are going to charge you for borrowing money in the interim before you actually get the debt position under control. So these are the four basic areas. And these are the areas that we look at all the time when we assess governments. Now, when we look at Canada, and I'm here to talk about interest rates primarily, others can talk about provincial debt problems and the deficit. But we look at Canada, I was struck by the Minister of Finance talking about her chat with the Minister of Finance 25 years ago, but some of us probably remember the free trade agreement with the United States in the late 1980s, serious recession, particularly in Ontario, where a lot of the manufacturing got restructured, i.e. there was a lot of bankruptcies. During that period and prior to the late 90s, government debt in Canada was about 1.25% yields, interest rates higher than the United States. I know someone's going to be talking about austerity, but the Liberal government in 1995 brought in an austerity program. So that sounds like 26 years ago, and some of you may not realize this, or probably have never even heard of it, but the government cut program spending 20% across the board. Almost every element of program spending was cut. The only element that wasn't cut was Indian and Northern Affairs. And within a short period of time, by 1997, we ended up getting surpluses in Canada. And for about 7 years, the federal government ran surpluses. And when you're running operating surpluses, GDP grows, the debt to GDP basically falls. And Canada, quite soon, by the mid-2000s, had interest rates lower than the United States. And I remember vividly in the 90s, people thought this wasn't possible, but it turned out it was possible. And not only did we have long-term interest rates lower than the United States, right up until now, and in fact forecast now, we still have interest rates lower than the United States. Because when you look at the people buying the bonds, it's basically supply and demand. It's not rocket science. As we restricted the supply of Government of Canada bonds because we were running surpluses, we ended up creating higher prices and lower interest rates on those bonds. So we got the benefit of lower interest rates. If you dump more bonds on the bond market, supply and demand, it's not rocket science. You dump a lot of bonds on the market, prices go down, interest rates go up. So we'll be talking about debt and deficits, but overall the big picture is we have this dramatic drop in interest rates over the last 25 years. If you've got to borrow money, right now the situation is such that we have very low interest rates. And I'll talk about whether that's going to continue in the future. But that's the overall picture. Newfoundland is not the federal government. When we look at subnational or non-national governments, we look at their credit ratings. I was struck this morning when the Minister of Finance mentioned that Moody's had removed the negative outlook. But at the moment, Newfoundland is rated A, depending on which agency you look at it. And these are the spreads. How much different groups pay to borrow over federal government debt. Federal government debt is basically low risk in the sense that it's default free, because we don't expect the federal government to default on its debt, because it can get the Bank of Canada to issue Canadian government banknotes basically to pay off that debt. So when we look at this, I'd like you to take a couple of points from this. First of all, the markets are entirely predictable. Whenever we go into recession, people panic. Some of you may have heard the Warren Buffett's famous phrase, when the fearful, get greedy, and when the greedy, get fearful. Well, during recessions, people get fearful. And what do they do in the bond market? They sell anything that has risk attached to it. And they buy government bonds. And what I should say is the bond market is an institutional market. It's dominated by insurance companies, by pension funds, and they just move a little bit of money from, say, A bonds or BBB rated bonds into government bonds, and the yields, the interest rates change. And these are the spreads for the A and the spreads for the BBB. BBB is still what we call investment grade. Below BBB, BB is non-investment grade. There's barely a market in Canada for non-investment grade. BBB is the one that gets hit in financial crises. We can see, for example, in the 90s, the spread for BBB rated debt in Canada zoomed. And that was basically a lot of medium-sized manufacturing firms in Ontario that suddenly found that they were paying significant amounts of money to borrow money. And this is still investment-grade companies. So when we look at this right the way across the board, what we need to be aware of is that when things get rough in a recession, sometimes it's difficult for BBB companies to raise money. Even A-rated companies have some difficulty sometimes. That's just the way the markets work. Generally, it doesn't last that long, but when you're in it, it seems to last forever. So it's easy for me to put a graph up and say, well, it only lasts a year. But if that's the year when you're trying to raise money, if you're a corporation and you've got a BBB bond rating, it is difficult. So now let's look at Newfoundland. Newfoundland is, can default, can reschedule its debts. These are things the bond market doesn't like. It's rated A, similar to corporations. And this is the 30-year spreads for the province. And there's something going on in the 90s which somebody would probably tell me what it is, but I don't know what it is for those spikes way back in the 90s on the blue line. But the blue line is the provincial debt spreads over Canada, how many extra percentage points it costs the province to borrow. And I've got in there as well Ontario. I was struck by the report to the province back in May to discover that somebody had more debt than the province of Ontario, which is you guys. It's basically the same. But the province is seen as a lot lower risk simply because we've got 14 million people, and the province, I wouldn't say is Canada, but it's difficult to see how the province can have difficulties when it's such an important part of Canada. But we look at the province of Ontario as the base for provincial debt, and you can quite clearly see peak oil prices in the late 2000s when this province was treated like Ontario. Some of you may remember 2008 when the price of oil went to $140 a barrel. You may even remember when we could take our Canadian dollars down to New York and they gave us more American dollars for our Canadian dollars. So that was a unique period. But it was a period when the province had easy access to capital markets. It's a standard problem. Everybody will lend you money when you don't really need it. And the province didn't really need it with $140 a barrel for oil. And this period lasts up until about 2015, when the provincial growth rate started to drop. And the striking thing is the increase in the Newfoundland spreads over the province of Ontario. So the message here is don't think people aren't looking at provincial debt and deficits. The capital markets are looking at every province and they're looking at every corporation in terms of are they willing to lend to this institution, what's its credit rating. These are the 10-year spreads, the 30-year market. The province of Ontario borrows 50-year debt. We have some utilities that borrow on 50-year debt. But generally, we start looking at 10-year debt. Everybody sort of has access to the 10-year market. And as you get longer and longer terms for the debt, it becomes more difficult to raise money on longer terms, simply because it's difficult to forecast what's going to happen over a 30, 40, 50-year time period. But these are the 10-year spreads, and it's more clearly the pattern that the province is basically that period of about 7 or 8 years when it was treated as the same as Ontario. That is no longer the case. And what is clearly the case is those spreads are getting more like a typical corporate A bond rating than the province, because generally on the same bond rating, provinces borrow cheaper than corporations. So don't believe everything when you look at the bond ratings. But what we've got is simply that the provinces, the capital markets are very much aware of what goes on in the province, and they've basically been rating the debt more recently for the last couple of years as equivalent to corporate A-rated debt. And as I said, when you get into financial crises, as you can see the COVID crisis here, the blue line pops up with the regular corporate A-rated debt. So that's what's going on in the bond markets. This is what I wrote, or we wrote 15 years ago. We were looking at what determines the cost of provincial borrowing, and we were looking at the debt, and every time we look at debt, it's not an absolute. We look at relative to some yardstick. So we look at the debt to GDP ratio for the province against the debt to GDP ratio for Canada as a whole. And we look at the deficit for the province against the deficit for Canada as a whole. Because when people are looking at the money, they're all saying, do I go here or do I go there? Where is it relatively? And right now, everybody's in debt, for which I'll get to. So it's clear that debt and deficits do have an impact on interest rates. They do have an impact on those spreads. And not only that, the two other factors are the openness of the province. And openness basically is the amount of trade. And Newfoundland is basically quite open because of its dependence upon oil. So unlike some other provinces that are basically intra-provincial trade and not that exposed to external factors, the province is exposed to external factors. And the other one is employment. Just think about that in terms of demographics. And it's a question of how many people in the province are actually working. The higher the participation rate in the province, the more ability the province has to raise tax money to service debt. So what's driving the yield spreads, at least when we did this 15 years ago, was debt, deficits, the openness of the province, and the participation rate within the province. All of those leave Newfoundland as vulnerable. Now, I have stacks of overheads, and I don't have my yellow or my red card yet, or I think she's about to bring it out. Okay, well, I will just say a little bit about the big picture. We know we're coming out of COVID-19. We know this is from the federal government's budget briefings in April. The federal government, there's an old phrase in politics, you never let a good crisis go to waste. The federal government's dramatically increased spending above what was needed for COVID-19, and in fact has increased spending more recently. But we're looking at basically 20 to 25% of GDP in federal government spending. Huge, huge amount of money. How much? The federal government has basically doubled Canada's debt in the last 4 years. So just let that sink in. Doubled the debt in the last 4 years. It's gone from basically $700 billion to $1.2 billion as of the end of the last fiscal year, and it'll basically be up to $1.4 trillion. So there's a huge increase in government debt. So when you look at this, most economists look at this and say, what happens when you dump $700 billion worth of debt in the bond market? Normally, prices go down. Like everything else, when you dump a huge amount of money onto the market, prices go down, interest rates go up. That hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? It's because the Bank of Canada has intervened in the bond market, and it initially was buying $5 billion of government securities every week, $260 billion a year, and basically buying provincial bonds, mortgage bonds, all sorts of debt out there. Where are we now? This is from the latest report of the Bank of Canada. Most of the temporary spending programs by the Bank of Canada have stopped. The big one is that blue one, which is the purchase of government bonds. We are not Zimbabwe. We are not having the government simply print banknotes to buy things. We're doing it through the back door, in the sense that the Bank of Canada is buying the bulk of the debt issued by the federal government. This is not unusual. What has happened, and this is the Bank of Canada's balance sheet, is that money hasn't gone into banknotes. It has not gone into spending. It's basically all gone back to the Bank of Canada as deposits, or almost all has gone back to the Bank of Canada in deposits. So the Bank of Canada has been buying federal government debt, and it's been paying for it with money that could go into to banknotes and get spent, but it hasn't. It's just been on deposit. We haven't seen the increase in demand as a result of this enormous fiscal policy. Why is that? It's because of something John Maynard Keynes said 90 years ago, which is called the paradox of thrift, that when things get rough, they don't listen to Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett, as I said, when the fearful get fearful, you should get greedy. That's not what happens. When the fearful get fearful, they save. And we look at the saving all the way around the world, and I look at the UK up here, 19.4% savings rate. Typically, it's about 2%. And when we look at Canada, 14.3% savings. A lot of the money that's been injected into Canada and the UK and the US and Europe has basically been saved. It has not been spent. So they asked me to comment on interest rates, and this is globally. We're looking at about $20 to $25 trillion of government spending that has basically gone into savings. So where are interest rates going to go? It depends upon us. It depends upon whether we start spending the savings that has been accumulated, and whether as a result the banks draw down on their deposits to the central banks, and whether they support loans, and if they do, without further government intervention, we're going to get an increase in spending. Now, the current problem is what's the inflation rate? The inflation rate in the US has just come down to about 4% or 5%, I forget what it is. Interest rates at the moment haven't budged because we're saving such a phenomenal amount of money. And why are we saving that around? Partly I'll look around the audience. It's because of us boomers. Us baby boomers are basically saving, and we're putting our savings into low-risk securities rather than risking them in equity securities. And that's where a lot of the savings is going. Paying down credit card balances, saving money for retirement or for our retirement years. What happens in the future largely depends upon whether people are going to basically liberate some of those savings and start spending money. If it does, interest rates and inflation could increase significantly. And that's what the capital markets are worried about at the moment. Are we going to get consistent inflation, a big increase in demand, and big interest rates increases? One thing's for certain is that interest rates are not going to come down any lower than they are at the moment. And if interest rates do increase, it's the vulnerable provinces and the vulnerable corporations and the people who borrowed highly indebtedly to buy houses are the ones that are going to suffer. Okay, have I used up my time or have I got more time? Okay, well, I've got stacks of slides. Just to put things in perspective, and people don't realize how much intervention has happened by the central banks. This is the US Federal Reserve. Back in 2008, the Fed basically had bought about $800 billion worth of US government securities. Right now, that's up to about $9 trillion. So that is what the capital markets are looking at. They're looking at the central banks, and they're looking about how much government debt that they've bought and whether that debt is ever going to get materialized in terms of the banks drawing down on their deposits and basically providing us with loans. And at the moment, loan demand, apart from housing, is relatively weak. The banks could lend huge amounts of money, given the deposits they have at the central banks. And if that goes out, one of the things we teach in any basic macroeconomics course is the money multiplier, the loan multiplier. At the moment, it's collapsed. There's all of this liquidity that could be lent and will be lent if people want to borrow money. And as I said, this is the key thing that all of the capital markets are looking at the moment, which is the balance sheets of the central banks. I used to tell people that after the US financial crisis, Canada was in great shape. The Bank of Canada did not intervene in the bond market way back in 2008, 2009. Canada had exceptionally strong finances. That is not the case now compared to where we were in 2010, 2011. Now, we have basically used up a lot of the credit card that, I hate to say it, the Conservatives left to the Liberal government. The Liberal government wouldn't have been allowed to spend $700 billion except for the fact that we basically had a clean bill of health in terms of the global capital markets. And some of you may realize that we were a AAA rated institution, a country, when the United States was not, and the UK was not. And the rating for the country attracted a lot of foreign capital into Canada. At 1.40% of the Canadian bond market was basically owned by non-residents. Why? Because we actually had positive interest rates, whereas in Europe they had negative interest rates. This is one of the big puzzles in economics. How can you have negative interest rates throughout the European financial system? Okay, you're going to hook me? Okay, I'll answer any questions. As I said, I've got a lot of overheads. I may have gone a little bit quicker than I thought because I was worried I wasn't going to be able to get through my overheads.
You were spot on, even better. Okay, we'll take some questions. I'll take over here. Herb first.
Hi, great presentation, Lawrence. Herb Emery, Wade asked me to do some moderating of some online questions, and I wanted to give you two quick hitters with my apologies to the questioners if I butchered the question. The first one that's top of mind with a lot of people since the pandemic is something called modern monetary theory.
Absolute nonsense.
I'd like to get to that. So the question is, and I think you answered it in your presentation, but could you clarify what the Bank of Canada is doing? Is it modern monetary theory or is it not? And what would make it? And then the second question that comes up is really an interesting strategic one. Would capital markets reward a provincial government that, say, cut taxes to stimulate population growth and business growth with potentially lower interest costs? And related to that, if you have a federal government that's committing to phasing out fossil fuels and transitioning the economy of Newfoundland, will that negatively impact the capital market? I think everyone's just trying to get a sense of what these invisible capitalists are looking for when governments set policy if they're trying to get a leg up. Thanks.
Okay, well, first of all, these invisible capitalists are actually very visible. 60% of the equity market is owned by institutions, not individuals. So if you remember old Monopoly sets when you were children, you had this picture of the tycoon in the black hat and his black cane walking along. That's not modern economics. The bond market is primarily pension funds and insurance companies. So when we talk about the capitalists, it's our pension money. And as we age, more money goes into pension funds and they become way more important in the overall capital market. So the visible capitalists that buy the provincial debt is the Canada Pension Plan. And it's Manulife Financial. It's the people basically that are providing our pensions at some future date. And that's sort of a basic change that's been occurring over the last 50 years. Now, modern monetary theory. I was in Zimbabwe 4 years ago, and I purchased some billion-dollar notes. And when I teach this to my students, I say, look, everyone says, if you're so clever, how come you're not rich? And I pull out my Zimbabwe billion-dollar notes and say, I didn't tell you I'm a billionaire. And I paid, I think it was $25 for a whole wad of $100,000, 5 million, 50 billion. I didn't pay for the $1 trillion note. That is modern monetary theory. The idea that the bank or the government can just spend money and print notes. What is happening in Canada and the United States is basically it's backdoor financing of the government. And there's still tools that the central bank can use to manage a situation of Zimbabwe where we had they have phenomenal inflation. And there's a whole series of countries that have practiced modern monetary theory, which is basically saying you just print dollar bills by the government to buy things. That generates inflation sooner or later. I had a very good friend who was brought up in Argentina. They used to shop in the morning. And I tell students this and say, why would they shop in the morning? Answer, the prices are higher in the afternoon. That's inflation. Inflation is very real. It hasn't gone away. It will come back if the same situation comes back. And when I look at our situation at the moment, the central banks are clever. They have a lot of tools left. When we start looking at the debt in Canada, the UK, and the US, it looks a lot like 1945. And none of us here, I think, can remember 1945, but the debt was huge. And we came out of the Second World War owing about 250% of GDP. In the UK, we had austerity right the way through for the next 10 years, rationing of basic products in the UK to get the debt down. Not only that, we had tax rates in the UK of 95% on what was euphemistically called unearned income. which we in Canada call passive income or investment income. So 95% tax rates, rationing, and then they had compulsory measures for the banks to buy the government debt. So there are ways of getting out of debt problems, and the central bank hasn't used up its ammunition. It can prevent inflation without too much trouble, but there'll be drastic changes, particularly in the banking system. The other thing when we talk about debt, what's important, we talk about this in credit courses, the 5 C's of credit. The number one is character. You don't lend money to people who you think are crooks. And it's amazing, Argentina's gone bankrupt 15 times. I wonder why we keep still lending to Argentina, because you know very well they will go bankrupt again. But we talk about character. Everything else, capacity, collateral, market conditions, is secondary to character. The bond markets and lenders will lend money to people they know who will take measures in order to pay it back. So character, is it important to make changes, to be seen to be doing things? Yes, it is. If you don't show character and willingness and commitment to walk the line and walk the talk, as it were, then they won't lend you the money. So it's very important that the province shows responsibility in terms of its commitments, because that debt is owned in our pension funds. And if you default, not that you're going to, but I mean if provinces default, our pension funds take the hit. It's not some mysterious capitalist out there that's bought the provincial government debt. It's our pension funds and its insurance companies. Now, I don't know whether I answered all your questions.
Herb, I think you... She's over there.
Don't know.
Ruth, thank you for translating so much of that for those of us who this is not our bailiwick. So I'm going to ask a big picture question on behalf of those of us who struggled to keep up during the whole presentation. You outlined the significant, what was a key message for me, the clear increase that our country has done in spending over the last 4 years. And it is so dramatic that I asked myself, why did we do that? Our country, do you, in your opinion, could you offer some conjecture on, is this a move that is forward-looking or reactionary? Because when I look forward into, and we've just, again, I loved how you said it never, always take advantage of a good crisis. And I see that clearly. I feel that what will impact us economically in the coming years is is this, do you believe, perhaps connected to the coming climate change crisis, which is perhaps starting to significantly impact Canada's GDP in terms of our food growing and things like that? Like, it's such a big increase. I'm asking, do you think they are actually doing this to prepare for a crisis that they see coming?
Very good question. It gets me into areas that I'm not an expert in terms of the impact of climate change on Canada. What I would say, I'm an avid reader of The Economist, and mainly because it's political economy more than economics and it's global. They point out that Canada is one of the big gainers from global warming, primarily because there's already been a movement of crops upwards because it's getting hotter south. So we're seeing on the prairies the ability to grow crops that wouldn't have been there 20 years ago. So it's important to look at the global impact, which clearly is negative, but it's not necessarily as negative as we think for Canada, certainly in terms of agriculture. And I went to a presentation by one of our leading banks who basically was not lending money, insurance companies, was not lending any more money to resource firms as a result of global warming. And I asked them, I said, do you realize that our standard of living depends upon natural resources, and that this has a direct impact on what's going to happen for the Canadian standard of living? So I'm on the fence in terms of the long-term impact of global warming on Canada. It's certainly negative globally, but if it gets a little bit warmer in Newfoundland, and it gets a little bit warmer in Ontario, and we just had a report from the federal government, the number of extreme days, their extreme days was anything over 29 degrees Celsius in Vancouver. I don't know about you, but I don't regard 29 degrees as being that hot. So it's outside my area of expertise. All I can say is that I wouldn't take a global doomsday scenario and translate it into Canada immediately, because we are reliant still on natural resources, which is supporting our standard of living. And when you look at it globally, a ton of methane and carbon dioxide is the same whether it comes from China or Canada. And look at the statistics on who is actually producing climate-changing carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. It's China. And China is exempt from the Paris Accord. So until you get a genuine global commitment on climate change that brings down the emission of the gases that are causing the problem, you have to include China. If you don't include China and you don't include Russia, you're taking two of the three biggest polluters out of the equation, which doesn't make much sense to me. Sorry, that may not be politically acceptable, but a ton of pollution is the same wherever it comes from.
On that note, thank you for those questions. We're up to our time, and thank you, Dr. Ruth, for that presentation.